Hey everyone, this is Kevin, your failed journalist, and welcome to an editorial video of some sorts. I am a huge fan of 3D. I actually own a 3D run blog. I talk about 3D sometimes this channel. And here's the thing, I have actually invested heavily in TVs that still have 3D viewing capabilities. I will probably always invest in that because even though some people don't like 3D, I really enjoy the format, and I have over a few hundred titles on disc where I can watch 3D at home, and by the way, have been doing so since this pandemic. However, that does not mean you can get everything on 3D. Despite the fact that 3D has come to the home and continues to be in the home in some form or another, there are actually quite a few 3D movies that cannot actually be legally viewed anymore. They're in a vault or they're lost to the time, one way or another. You cannot watch these 3D versions anymore. And I have compiled a list of 10 3D movies that you can no longer watch if you wanted to. Now, a word about this list. Just because the movie's on this list doesn't necessarily mean that the movie itself is or isn't worth watching. All I'm saying is that there's a 3D version of this movie that exists that you cannot legally watch at the moment and have no way of actually accessing. That is the point of the list. So without further ado, let's start with these 10 movies in no particular order. Now, the first movie on this list was so rare, it technically wasn't even released to the public. See, during the new 3D boom that Avatar ushered in, Disney was one of the first major companies to jump onto the craze in a big way. It might partially because their own Alice in Wonderland became a billion-dollar success largely thanks to 3D upcharges, but whatever. Many people wanted Disney to get in on that sweet 3D bandwagon and start releasing new movies and old movies in 3 dimensions. Disney complied first by re-releasing the first 2 Toy Story movies in limited 3D engagements that ultimately got extended because they were so successful. Then they announced more animated classics would be released in theaters in 3D. We got The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Finding Nemo, and Monsters Incorporated in theaters. However, a planned 3D re-release of Little Mermaid went straight to home video. However, there were multiple reports that Disney was also working on a 3D re-release of Aladdin. Many who had worked for Disney confirmed it was being worked on, and it even got a release date targeted, but nothing came from it. Granted, this wouldn't be the first time Aladdin got the shaft at the mouse. The film was remastered for an IMAX re-release at one point in time, and even got so far as to have a commercial shown before the re-release of The Lion King in IMAX. However, that release got canceled amidst diminishing returns at the box office. Insider information is mixed on how real the 3D version was, or if the conversion of Aladdin was even finished. Still, there was enough websites out there claiming that it was coming out with such certainty that even though this is the one title on this list that needs to be brandished with a rumor warning, it's very likely Disney once again got cold feet and changed their minds midway through. This wouldn't be the first time Disney would lock a 3D release into their famous Disney Vault, and they would do it again with another film they would soon own. Because before they bought Lucasfilm and created a new line of Star Wars movies with questionable quality that divided audiences, George Lucas was actually banking on 3D to bring Star Wars to a new generation of kids. This isn't the first time he would do this. After all, the reason Lucas had the luxury of sitting on the toilet and wiping his butt with dollar bills is because Star Wars re-releases were so profitable, he largely didn't need to make new movies. Every time there was a re-release, we'd get changes like with the special edition, so really, 3D was the next logical step. The first of those releases was Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, a film so forgettable people actually think this is the worst Star Wars movie these days. The release also included a few visual changes like a fully CGI Yoda replacing the puppet, but ultimately the promise of seeing a galaxy far, far away in 3D wasn't as much of a draw as Lucas had hoped. It might have underperformed partly because 3D wasn't as big of a draw at this point, or it might have been because Lucas decided to show the movies in chronological order, and people did not want to pay extra money to see the prequel trilogy. I was one of the few people who saw the movie in Cinemark XD 3D, and I have to say the conversion was very good and brought some extra intensity to the pod racing scene and Duel of Fate sequence, which, overall movie aside, may be one of the best fight sequences ever made. But the ticket also costs about $18, and we're talking about The Phantom Menace here. The older you get, the less you want to spend valuable time on movies like this. Shortly afterwards, Lucas cashed in his chips and sold Lucasfilm to Disney. Though it's reported 3D versions were made for all the Star Wars movies at this point, Disney, wisely in retrospect, decided that releasing 3D versions of movies people didn't like probably wasn't the best way to keep the franchise in the public's eye, and scrapped plans to release the rest while they focus on The Force Awakens. If 3D had stuck around, chances are there would have been a giant box set with all the movies in 3D, but that didn't quite work out, and now the 3D version of The Phantom Menace remains in a vault somewhere and has not been seen since. However, Disney apparently isn't the only company that likes locking films they've made into a mystic vault. Because unlike most movies on the list, not only is the 3D version of U2 3D a rarity, but the film itself is one you can't really see anymore in any form. Made to take advantage of fledgling 3D technology, U2 3D was U2 wanting to take the format and make the ultimate 3D concert experience. And yeah, they more or less pulled it off. The movie received great reviews, and IMAX 3D showings were frequently sold out for weeks. People liked the music, they liked the 3D effects, and even people who hated 3D seemed to agree that the experience was a fun one, which confirms my theory that 3D mainly died because of underwhelming 3D movies rather than the fact that no one liked it to begin with. Despite coming out early in the 3D boom, the movie has not been released on Blu-ray 3D or even DVD. No, the movie remains locked in a vault, showing up occasionally at film festivals who have an IMAX that can project 70mm film. U2 says they won't release the film on home viewing until home 3D has caught up with the technical capabilities of the movie theater. Basically, they want to make sure that the experience is the absolute best that it can be, and there will be no compromises to the picture quality. Which means we'll likely be waiting quite some time before that happens. But as someone who did see this in IMAX 3D years ago, I can tell you it was certainly something else, and I highly recommend you grab the opportunity to see it if you are given the chance. Now then, our next couple of movies are strange because they come from DreamWorks Animation. And if there is one company that consistently does 3D animation well, in terms of, actual 3D depth and everything like that, it's DreamWorks. In fact, DreamWorks movies are several of the reasons I will never get rid of my 3D TV. With How to Train Your Dragon, Kung Fu Panda, and Mr. Peabody and Sherman being some of the best uses of the 3D format you're going to see. Interestingly, there were a few years where DreamWorks movies weren't being released on Blu-ray 3D, which means movies like Trolls have not been released on Blu-ray 3D. This, despite the fact that, as usual, Trolls is a great example of how to properly use the 3D format. With lots of vibrant energy, images that pop out, depth that is great. It's just a wonder to see in 3D, and it's a shame we can't do it. Another DreamWorks movie to be kept hidden since its initial release is Captain Underpants, the first epic movie, which arguably benefits even more from the 3D format, which is amazing because the animation is much more fast-paced than most films, and 3D tends to struggle if images are moving too fast. Somehow, Captain Underpants prevented this from being a problem, though, and this superhero spoof, which eventually became a fun superhero film in its own right, was one of the most dynamic 3D presentations I'd ever seen. However, like Trolls, the 3D version has not been released on home video and remains locked in a vault somewhere. But on a positive note, at least they resumed 3D home video releases with The Boss Baby. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm glad we got 3D releases back from them at all, but I'd much rather be rewatching Trolls and Captain Underpants than watching The Boss Baby in 3D. But if you want to discuss some 3D movies that are probably best left forgotten, one of them would be Creed. Yes, Creed, aka Rocky VII, actually got a 3D release. I'm one of 5 people who have actually seen the 3D version. Side note, there might actually be more than 5 people, but I don't know for sure. And I can confirm that it is as underwhelming as you would expect it to be. While there were a couple of good shots of a punch coming at you during a fight sequence, it truly doesn't benefit from being in 3D at all. What's more strange is that the 3D release was technically a re-release that came out when the movie was readily available on Blu-ray and in fact had just been released on Blu-ray, which begs the question why anyone decided to make it in the first place. Either way, a 3D version of Creed exists in a vault and there's no way for you to see it anymore. But if this 3D version isn't famous, the next movie on the list actually has a 3D version that's very infamous. Now then, a little bit of world history for you. Most movies that are going to be in this series are forgotten 3D movies because they were made specifically for the Chinese market. See, 3D is still huge in China, which is one of the reasons studios still make them. The bad thing is China also forces 3D on a lot of productions specifically to force that version into theaters and charge a premium for moviegoers, even if the 3D is actually not very good and in fact may make the movie considerably worse. And this is exactly what happened with Jason Bourne. When Jason Bourne was going to be released in China, a 3D version was mandated specifically for the Chinese market. The problem is the 3D version made people sick, gave splitting headaches, and resulted in many Chinese moviegoers demanding their money back, which is something that's very rare. So what went wrong? Well, I've got some ideas. See, great 3D can come from anything, but there are a few things a movie wants to focus on to get maximum usage out of the effect. Long shots help. Steady camera work is a must. If the movie has scenes where characters are flying or swimming, it will help, but you need to make sure there's a wide open space so the characters can float, if you will. Finally, it helps if the film was not only shot with 3D in mind, but with 3D cameras to boot. Jason Bourne is pretty much the opposite of everything I listed. It was not shot with 3D in mind. It has no long shots. The editing is chaotic and fast-paced. Also, the camera shakes. Like, it shakes a lot. When you combine all these components and try to force them into a 3D package, I can imagine pretty easily why that would be a miserable experience. The shaky camera is especially problematic for 3D because if the image isn't smooth on some level, the image will be blurry and induce headaches. For all intents and purposes, Jason Bourne was made to be a 2D film. Last I checked, director Paul Greengrass has no interest in the 3D format, and you know what? That's perfectly fine. Not everything needs to be in 3D. The problem is, this version was shown on 90% of theater screens in China, but the dislike for this version was so great and so swift that the following week the 3D version virtually disappeared and hasn't been seen since. And this is probably the one film on the list where that is a blessing. Sadly, while it's easy to understand why this 3D conversion has more or less disappeared, our next few films have had 3D versions disappear for strange reasons. Case in point, The Ant Bully. There aren't a lot of people who remember The Ant Bully. It's a charming little animated film from Warner Brothers starring Nicolas Cage, Julia Roberts, and for some reason Meryl Streep as ants in a colony who use magic to shrink a boy who gets off on torturing them. Because, yeah, that's a character you want as a main character of a family film. All joking aside, the movie is cute and it's harmless fun for kids. What made the movie popular at the time, though, was the IMAX 3D version, which was hailed by critics and audiences to be revolutionary.
That the massive experience of the IMAX theater in 3D as well, well, there's only one place you can go to get it. And so it brings an event status to a good movie is now an even more involving experience when you see it on that big, massive, bigger than big is big IMAX screen.
It was so impressive, I saw it twice in theaters, and I didn't even care that much for the movie, if we're being perfectly honest. Ironically, even though it is one of the most acclaimed 3D movies of all time, and being released long before the 3D boom even got into gear, a home video release of this version has never surfaced. There was never even talk of it coming out. Now, this might have somewhat to do with the fact that even though the 3D version was greatly acclaimed, the movie itself simply wasn't. Most people forgot the movie fairly quickly, and it didn't appear to sell that well on either the, at the time, new Blu-ray or HD DVD formats. Still, even with that in mind, it is a head-scratcher we never got a proper release because, huge hit or not, when Blu-ray 3D was launched, it was starving for content. This would have made a great tech demo for the TVs. Why this never happened, I suppose we'll never know, but for the few fans that are out there, they will tell you that the 3D version was quite the special thing to see, and it's a shame it hasn't been seen in over a decade. However, while you could argue that the time for the Ant Bully had come and gone, the release of Jackass 3D was notable because this was primed for a 3D home viewing experience. This third installment, in which future Darwin Award winners put themselves in unnecessary danger for laughs, was built with 3D in mind. It even opened with a short skit of Beavis and Butthead explaining how the 3D format worked.
Good evening. I'm Butthead. The movie you're about to see will be presented using special 3D technology. You will see the jackasses like no human being has ever seen them before.
In order to experience this new dimension, you must put on the special glasses that you were given in the lobby.
Look at my hand. It's in 3D.
Oh, really? I don't really see it. Whoa! Whoa, that's amazing!
Despite all this, the movie didn't come out on home video despite the fact that the Blu-ray 3D format had already been out for several months. Rumor has it that the release got held back due to low sales of M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender. While I obviously can't confirm that's what happened, it is true that initial sales for the format were largely not impressive, with Avatar and How to Train Your Dragon being major exceptions to the rule. Paramount would eventually release a lot more 3D titles on home video, but Jackass 3D was never one of them, much to the annoyance of Jackass fans everywhere. Finally, we get to the movie that hurts the most to put it on this list. Because as someone who's actually seen this on like the one IMAX that was showing it in the world, I can tell you right now that the 3D version of this movie was spectacular. It was a movie that was filmed in 3D, conceptualized in 3D. It took movement into account. Every part of it was designed with 3D in mind. It was a truly immersive experience. That movie was Mowgli: The Legend Begins. A dark PG-13 telling of the classic story directed by Gollum himself, Mowgli is the type of 3D movie that really makes you go, wow, as it immerses you in another world. Warner Brothers had hoped that this would be the start of an epic franchise for the studio, and Andy Serkis was keen to show, after working with Peter Jackson for so many years, he was capable of directing epic films of his own. There were a couple of problems, though. The first problem was that the movie, frankly, wasn't very good, which wouldn't normally kill a movie, but what made things worse was that 2 years ago, Jon Favreau directed his own 3D version of The Jungle Book for Disney, and that movie, as well as the 3D itself, was very well received by audiences. So facing a situation where Warner Brothers would be accused of basically copying Disney and standing to lose a lot of money on a movie that wasn't very good and cost an arm and a leg to produce, they sold the film rights to Netflix. Now, Netflix had promised to give this a major theatrical push with, regular screens, 3D screens, IMAX screens, the works. But ultimately ended up dumping the movie on 7 3D screens in America and an IMAX for 1 week before dropping it on their streaming platform. The few people who did decide to watch it had to do so on a small TV screen without the visual flair that would have made an otherwise forgettable film only slightly less forgettable. So, why haven't we gotten a home video release of this on 3D? Well, probably because Netflix doesn't really like to release much of anything on physical media. Mowgli isn't even on DVD or Blu-ray, and they certainly aren't streaming anything in 3D. A few of their movies have been released via the Criterion Collection, but somehow I doubt Criterion would look at Mowgli as an important piece of cinema, so holding your breath for a home video release of this one in general seems like a good way to deprive your brain of oxygen and wind up in the hospital. Though they did include several John Waters films as part of their collection, as well as Armageddon, so I suppose anything's possible. And that brings us to the end of our list. Those are 10 3D movies that you can no longer see anymore. Now, this might change. Who knows? You might be watching this one day and, hey, these movies are now available. Great. I am so glad when this list will be outdated. But for the time being, as of this posting, those 3D movies cannot be seen anywhere. Now, some of you might be asking at this point, why didn't I make this a top 10 list? And the reason is, while I was originally going to make a top 10 list, I realized there's actually several dozen modern 3D films that you cannot watch anymore. So I've decided this is simply going to be volume 1 of a multi-volume series. So I don't know when the next volume is going to come out, but join us because we will be doing volume 2 where we will look at 10 other 3D films that you can no longer watch in any capacity. But in the meantime, if you like this, dislike it, I would love to know what your thoughts on this are. Comment below, like, favorite, share, subscribe, and as always, flame responsibly. Have a good one.